Our Cafe Europa. This is our first of this semester. We're going to have another one coming up in March. Watch for that one, because that one is about politics and fast food in Europe, and especially talking about revolution in fast food, which is going to be really fun. Bob Hudson will be organizing that one, so keep an eye out for that for our next Cafe Europa coming up in March. The way we run this is that I opened this up to the entire European Studies affiliate faculty. We've got about 90 affiliate faculty. And so here, we've got these Cafe Europa meetings, and we want to go ahead and do them in winter, even though we don't have a class running at that time. So let's try this. And we had people submit different ideas, different things that they wanted to talk about. And Jason was very passionate. Jason Kerr from English, metaphorically through email, pounded his fist on the table and said, it is really important that we talk about the Windrush generation, because this is 75th anniversary, and this is a world-changing event and a really interesting focus point from which to discuss immigration in Europe. And immigration was one of our big topics this year in a lot of the things that we're doing, in a lot of the classes that we're teaching. And so we turned that over to him. And so this is going to be kind of an information thing. Usually we like to be light on the presentation and heavy on the discussion. This time he's going to give us a little bit of background information that will help us to understand what's going on. Do we have European Studies majors here in the audience? Raise your hand. European Studies majors, because this is the thing I'm doing. For European Studies majors who come to the Cafe Europa things this semester, we're going to put you in a drawing for a free lunch with a European Studies faculty affiliate of your choice. And so remind me before you leave. I need to put all three of you. Tell me your name. Yes. Bryce. Okay, you're Bryce Peterson? No, Bryce. Okay, I knew it was a son in there. Okay, so Bryce and Nathan and Marina. Okay, I'm going to put your names in there. We're going to do a drawing, and we'll let you know. And we want to introduce you to some of the faculty members. Do we have any of our European Studies affiliate faculty members here? Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your supporting us and being with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason Kerr from the English department, who writes about Milton and has interests across the centuries. He's a Renaissance man, not only because he can talk about the Renaissance, but because he has such a great depth in so many different areas, and we appreciate having him on our affiliated faculty. And this is Simon Greathead from the Marriott School, who works in global supply chain management, and who runs our European Studies classes in the Marriott School, and is our connection, and is a very devoted part of our executive committee for the European Studies. And we appreciate all of you and your time, and we'd like to welcome you. What's going to happen is we're going to chat until about, we'll have Jason, then we'll have he'll give a little bit of presentation. We'll have about 20 minutes of chat, and then maybe at 20 to 5, we have a microphone here, or you can just go up and plop down at their table with them and ask them a question. But we do have a microphone there if you want to just march up there. Or if you don't want to march up to the microphone, just raise your hand and howl, and say it out loud, like Audrey Dew in my ward, our 90-year-old woman who just stands up where she is and sings a primary song and then gives her testimony every testimony meeting. Am I lying? No, I'm right. Okay.
She's louder without. I would be with the microphone.
She's louder without. It's exactly right. So you can do it Audrey Dew style. All right. So thank you for coming, and please join me in welcoming Jason Kerr and Simon Greathead.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and glad to have the chance to talk with all of you for a little bit about something that I think is very important. So I just want to show you an image of the ship itself. This is HMT Empire Windrush, which docked at Tilbury, east of London, on the 22nd of June, 1948. So it's technically last year. That's the 75th anniversary, but that's when I sent the email, so you know. So a lot of, there were 802 Caribbean people who came across on the Windrush. Most of them did not intend to stay in Britain for very long. They wanted to work for a few years and save some money and go back home. And some of them did go back, but many of them found it harder to return than they wished or intended. And because they stayed in Britain, Britain changed really significantly, and we're going to talk about some of those changes. So the first thing to say here is that as Rob told you, I'm a Milton scholar. I mostly hang out in the 17th century. So I'm not a specialist in this area, and the stories are so much bigger and so much more significant than we kind of really have time to talk about. So I wanted to kind of let you know about some books that you could read. The two in the center especially are based on oral histories, and so they contain lots of stories of Windrush people in their own voices telling their stories, and so I really commend those to you so that you can hear in their own words. So the presentation I'm going to give here is an attempt to balance the particular and the perennial. So there are things about the particular experience that, is really just about what people went through. But there are things that in their experience that also just speak to like really current issues. And so the particular, I'm going to kind of give a broad stroke sense of British history since 1948, told in a way that centers Windrush immigrants and their descendants. The perennial involves questions about migration, race, citizenship, and government policy. So the first thing I want to say is that Britain did not become multicultural in 1948, right? The idea that pre-1948 was some bastion of white racial purity is a myth. And so I've got some bangles here from 4th century York, which has demographically a higher percentage of African people in its population than Utah does in 2024. So we'll put that out there. Here's a picture of John Blank, who was in the court of Henry VII, and I think eventually Henry VIII as well, playing the trumpet. Here's Ignatius Sancho in the 18th century, a London shopkeeper who was born on a slave ship and became the first black person to vote in a British general election. This is obviously tip of an iceberg in terms of Black British history. You can look at David Olusoga's book for more about that. But just Britain has always been a multicultural place, and I'm highlighting African elements here. But as far back as we can go, like we know almost nothing about the Druids, right? Whoever the indigenous inhabitants of Britain were. But starting in like the 5th century BCE, you have Celtic immigration, 5th century CE, Germanic immigration, then you have Viking invasions, then you have Normans. In the last 10 years, there have been 2 11th century Chinese coins discovered in Britain, showing that England was connected into global trade networks, even in the Middle Ages. And so people move, and this is a perennial story, right? I just want to highlight, this is also an important kind of backstory to why did Windrush people come to Britain? And this quote here at the bottom from Balavanar Sivanandan really captures something. We are here because you were there. And so why did people of African descent come from the Caribbean to Britain? It was because of Britain's colonial efforts in the Caribbean and the transatlantic slave trade, right? There's something a bit obtuse and like even naive about asking, where did you come from and why are you here? Like, we are here because you were there, is Sivanandan's pithy response to that. So, a lot of Windrush people came because of World War II, and so many West Indians volunteered for the British military during World War II. They felt like it was their patriotic duty. They understood themselves as British. Like, to be British was a core part of their identity. And so when the mother country called, they were happy to answer. And so many of them enlisted in the RAF, lived in the UK during World War II, and it's not that they didn't experience racism while in the RAF, but they found that it was relatively muted, as people reported in the oral histories. Racism was more pronounced when they had encounters with American servicemen because the American military was segregated. And the American military wanted, the RAF was not segregated. So you had black and white servicemen working alongside each other. The Americans wanted British businesses and pubs to segregate, and this caused conflict. There were street fights in Manchester with black American soldiers, and a multiracial British contingent fighting against white American soldiers. Complicated stuff. But so because the experience of racism was relatively muted during the army time, they weren't prepared for how racist Britain was going to be when they came back without the uniform on. And so that was an issue. And patriotism can smooth some stuff over that might have, yeah. A relative detail here, we're going to think a little bit about legal history. So in 1948, Parliament passed the British Nationality Act, and what this did is it created a single citizenship status for everybody. So it didn't matter whether you lived in Jamaica or London, you were a citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. So there's a single citizenship status. And so that means that functionally taking a ship from Jamaica or Barbados to London is, legally it's the same as like taking a train from Birmingham to London, right? It's an internal journey as far as anyone's concerned. It's not really immigration. It's just movement, right? That's going to turn out to get complicated. So the Labour Party government and in Parliament, people heard about the Windrush coming over with all of these primarily Jamaican, they're not exclusively Jamaican, migrants, and people started to freak out a little bit. This is Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who sent this letter trying to calm the situation a little bit. And he says, and I'll just read little parts of this here, he says, "It is traditional that British subjects, whether of dominion or colonial origin and of whatever race or color, should be freely admissible to the United Kingdom. That tradition is not, in my view, to be lightly discarded, particularly at a time when we are importing foreign labor in large numbers, especially from Eastern Europe, lots of Polish immigrants, for instance, at this time. It would be fiercely resented in the colonies themselves, and it would be a great mistake to take any measure which would tend to weaken the goodwill and loyalty of the colonies toward Great Britain. There are pressures toward independence in this time, so he's managing that. If our policy were to result in a great influx of undesirables, we might, however, unwillingly have to consider modifying it, but I would not be willing to consider that except on really compelling evidence, which I do not think exists at the present time." So this is a very complicated statement, and we could spend a long time on it, but it is, for better or for worse, Attlee saying, okay, look, we need to calm down and let people come in, and we're going to assume, we're not going to assume the worst. We're going to assume the best, and if the worst emerges, we'll deal with it, but that's not where we're at. So the reception of people is really complicated. And so because Britain was rebuilding after World War II, there were abundant jobs. They often weren't the jobs for which people have professional training in the Caribbean. So it didn't matter how good a teacher you were in Jamaica. You probably couldn't get a job as a teacher in England. So you could find jobs. Housing is where things were really difficult. And so there were no anti-discrimination housing laws yet. And so, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish was a common sign that people would see. So this is Peter Rackman, who is a notorious London slumlord. He himself was also an immigrant from Eastern Europe, but he was willing to rent to West Indians. And so a lot of people lived in really substandard accommodations. And in the discussion, maybe we could talk about the ways that West Indian people found to become homeowners, because that's its own interesting sort of like intercultural story of adaptation. Also, the first generation of Windrush immigrants were heavily male. So it was only later that a lot of women came over and the kind of gender balance righted itself. And so this means that there was a lot of intermarriage really early on. And again, lots of complicated stories and situations around that. But, so what it does is it creates a multiracial environment instead of, anyway. There's also significant white backlash. We're going to kind of talk about consistently. And so I'm kind of going to gesture toward this now and come back to it. But in 1958, there were significant riots in Nottingham, and then a couple weeks later in Notting Hill in London. And especially in Notting Hill, those riots are really clearly instigated by working class white youth, known as Teddy Boys, because they dressed in Edwardian style. And then shortly after those riots, like early in 1959, this young man, Kelso Cochran, is murdered by a gang of white youth, still an unsolved crime, stabbed outside of the tube station. And this is another sort of rallying moment in which people feel like he comes to symbolize a sort of like perennial, just like environment of violence against West Indian migrants. But it's easy to kind of focus on the negative part of the story, and I don't want to kind of let that overwhelm, right? And so a significant moment happened in 1950 when the West Indies cricket team defeated England in London, right? And And everybody was, I mean, there was calypso music composed to celebrate the event on the spot. The man I've pictured here, his name is Sonny Ramadine, and he's an important reminder that the West Indies were themselves a multicultural place, right? He is from the Indian subcontinent. His family had moved to, I think, Trinidad, and then he became part of the West Indian team and was a terrific bowler. So I mentioned a little bit about the kind of prejudice in the UK school system. So they were prejudiced against teachers. A lot of people felt that the schools in Jamaica were better than the schools in the UK, that they were receiving a higher quality of education in Jamaica from Jamaican teachers. But the UK school system just kind of defaulted everybody into remedial situations that didn't suit their actual educational attainment. And so the community responded with the Black education movement that organized supplementary schools that met on weekends because they really valued the education of their children. Like, if the schools aren't going to do it, we're going to do it. They had the capacity to do it. And so the kids went to bad schools on the weekdays and good schools on the weekend, right? It's a lot of school for kids, but it's demonstrates a commitment. And then also after the 1958 riots, like those did galvanize the community. And so one of the things, like sort of as a positive community building response, is the development of the Notting Hill Carnival, which still continues. And in the first years, it was tense negotiations with the police to allow it to continue. The police usually ended up breaking it up at some point, but now it's kind of an established thing. But to talk about making a place, like people have, like when you encounter a sort of like hostile situation, you can respond in different ways. So I've put up here the Reverend Carmel Jones, and so a lot of people like grew up strongly Christian in their Caribbean home countries, and had a shock when they arrived, right? So the biggest shock for Carmel Jones was, one, the cold. And two, having gone to church for the very first time, so elated, so delighted that I'm coming from an Anglican church back home. So he thinks of himself as a member of the Church of England. This is baked into his identity. So he shows up at the local parish, right? I went to join in worship, and so I did. But after the service, I was greeted by the vicar, who politely and nicely told me, "Thank you for coming, but I would be delighted if you didn't come back." And I said, "Why?" He said, "My congregation is uncomfortable in the company of black people." And Carmel Jones says, "You could just imagine what that meant to me." So his response is to become Pentecostal and form his own church movement, right? And he forms a credit union, helps Black Britons purchase homes. So he creates a sort of like alternative to establishment institutions, right? That's one move. Here's the kind of alternate move. So this is Wilford Wood, who is from Barbados and attended seminary, Anglican seminary in Barbados, and then comes over to England in 1961. And is ordained a priest in St. Paul's Cathedral. And from 1985 to 2003, he was Bishop of Croydon within the Diocese of Southwark, and he was the first black bishop in the Church of England. And when I'll talk a little bit later about some like significant events of the 1980s. He was deeply immersed in working with the community in that time. So the other option is to get in with the institutions and change them from within, right? There have been, the last Archbishop of York was black, and there's still black bishops in the Church of England. It's kind of normal now, because Wilford Wood fought for that option. So now we have to talk about some of the kind of just racism that happened. And so I've got over here Sir Oswald Mosley, who was a prominent British fascist. Lovely picture of him shaking hands with Mussolini. So he's one of the people who really helps to instigate the 1958 riots. He's giving all these "Keep Britain White" speeches, and that's like a predominant graffiti that people will see in London in this period. Most notoriously, however, is Enoch Powell, this man in the middle. So in 1968, he gives this speech, and it's known as the Rivers of Blood speech. Super cheery, right? I put up, this is him quoting a constituent whom he refers to as a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man, this constituent says. And so what Powell is doing is sort of like saying out loud in public what a lot of people are kind of saying more privately or feel like they're too ashamed to say, right? And so he says it out loud. And he kind of loses his position in the shadow cabinet of the Tory party as a result of this, but he also kind of, the effect of it is he gives a lot more people permission to talk in this way, right? Where they felt sort of like too ashamed to talk about it now, they feel like they can. And so this makes the 1970s super toxic. The other part of this, we have to talk about the police, right? So there's the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which colloquially got called the sus law. And so this means that if you looked suspicious, which is to say that if you had black skin and were on the streets, the police could stop and search you, right? And with no other pretext required. And this just gets really aggressive in the 70s toward black and Asian Britons. And so you have the National Front, which is sort of like the fascist descendant of Mosley's kind of Union of British Fascists, I think is the right term for it. And so the 70s are rough. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, if this will advance, there we go. Now we've got to talk about this event that happens in 1981 called the New Cross Fire in Deptford in kind of southeast London. So what happens is there's a party, the house where the party is being held catches fire, 13 teenagers die in the fire, and it's this like horrible tragedy. But the kind of really galling thing about it is that a couple days later there's this big fire in Ireland that similarly kind of, it's a house fire, people die. And immediately, like the Queen and the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, like, owe condolences to these people in Ireland. They're flying over to Ireland to sort of express, and they said nothing about the New Cross fire. And so let's just say that people noticed. So let's watch a little video here and get some sense of what happened. And hopefully the sound works, fingers crossed.
13 dead and nothing said.
13 dead and nothing said.
13 dead and nothing said.
The New Cross fire was one of the biggest tragedies in British history.
On March the 2nd, 1981, we black people took to the streets to stand up for our rights. We were fighting for justice for the victims of the fire, as well as the freedom and liberty to be treated like human beings. Thousands of black people marched from New Cross to Whitehall.
Racism was an everyday occurrence back then. We had Thatcher, as well as the lads, the police and the National Front to contend with.
But on that day, enough was enough.
It was a day of action that will never be forgotten.
It was a pinnacle moment where for the first time society had to see and hear us.
Although this day will forever be a victory, discrimination continues to riddle this country 40 years on. Therefore, we must stand united, ensure our voices are never silenced, fight for our existence and demand equality.
I'm just going to stop that there. So this is a protest. They marched down Fleet Street, which was still then the home of the British press, and had the reporters like yelling racist taunts down at the marchers and then printing them in the paper the next day. But the mass presence of people on the streets was this unmistakable, we are here, you have to deal with us moment, kind of watershed. So we've got to talk about one last thing here, and this brings us into more recent history, and this is it's known as the Windrush scandal. So I put up here a bit of the Windrush passenger list from the National Archives, showing the arrival of Sam King, who went on to become the mayor of Southwark. But in 2010, the Home Office in the UK, in an attempt just to save money, because it costs money to preserve documents, they destroyed the landing cards from people when they'd arrived and come over. This turned out to be a problem, because in 2012, when Theresa May was Home Secretary in the Cameron government, they were facing pressure from UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which was a strongly anti-immigrant party line. I mean, this is sort of like, these are the pressures leading up to Brexit, right? And so the Tory party wants to try to keep people voting Conservative by making these anti-immigrant appeals. And so I've got this quote here from Theresa May, and you know, just in the spirit of I'm not making this up, right? The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. We can deport first and hear appeals later. This is what she said. And so what happened is that the government denied access to housing, employment, medical care, and other services to people who could not prove that they had been in the UK since 1973. And so this primarily affected people who were children of the Windrush migrants. So often people, like, it would happen, so like the father of the family would migrate over, he would work for a few years, save money, and then like send back for the kids, right? So the kids sometimes migrated in a few years later, they stayed with grandparents or other things, right? And so we're talking about people here who have been living and working in the UK for 50 years, right? Who all of a sudden, like there's one story of a man going into the NHS for cancer treatment, and he finds he's denied treatment because he is not legally in the country. And he's like, I've been living here for 50 years, what are you talking about? So this is a thing, and crucially, the government had destroyed the documentary evidence that showed that they were in the country legally, right? And when they came over, they had every right to stay permanently. Could you demonstrate that you have been legally in the United States for your entire life with like robust documentary history? I'm not sure I could. Hang on, one more thing. So the effect of this sometimes is that people were deported to countries they'd left when they were 5, where they had no employment opportunities. So you have people like living homeless in Jamaica in their 60s. People losing access to healthcare, people losing their jobs, and then running up massive debt. They may be like pursuing what are kind of technically illegal housing things because the government will prosecute landlords who rent to people who are in the country illegally. So this is a major scandal. When it breaks, Theresa May is the prime minister, so her home secretary kind of takes the fall and has to kind of dodge the fact that her boss is the cause of all the problems. So this case raises questions about what it means to be a citizen, because the definitions of citizenship, I gestured toward that 1948 law, but the definitions of citizenship had changed over the years, right? They passed, the government's passed different immigration laws in 1962, 1973, 1981. So you kind of have to be an immigration lawyer to really understand the complexities of what it means to be here. But the question is, like, who is a citizen? In what circumstances do you count as a citizen? When the people who got ensnared in this scandal migrated, they were British citizens under the 1948 Act, right? They had full citizenship rights. They were undertaking functionally an internal journey. But what happened eventually is that they didn't look like citizens. And looking like a citizen turned out to matter more than being a citizen. And so this is a case that forces us to think about what really are the bases of citizenship rights? How do we think about those? How do we enforce them? What do you do when legal definitions of citizenship change under your feet? And because I can't end this presentation with the face of Theresa May, I'm going to put up a picture here of Lord Kitchener, who was a Trinidadian calypso musician who came over on the Windrush. And so with that, like, I will end talking, and we can open it up for questions, discussion. I'm happy to hear from you and any reflections that you may have.
Let me just share a couple of thoughts before we go on.
Yeah, please do.
And these are questions that Jason and I discussed regarding if I were a student, what would be questions that I might consider given the Windrush experience. So, number one, what are some key themes and stories we consider from the Windrush generation? If you look at many parts of the world today, they are also asking similar questions of what occurred during the time of Windrush. Second, how might we apply some of the lessons learned from the Windrush generation to current immigration issues in the world? Third, what are some of the challenges governments may face when considering immigration policy, in considering the Windrush experience. And lastly, probably one of the most important questions, looking at the complex experiences of the Windrush generation and their descendants, what can we learn about how to navigate a multicultural world from a perspective of faith? Thank you, Jason, for that.
Anyone you want to respond to any of those yourselves first before we have another?
I've talked quite a lot, so I'm curious in your.
So what question would you like us to discuss of those three? Sorry, four.
I think the topics on current day immigration are very interesting. Some of it can be complicated, as it always is, but yeah, I think that's an interesting topic.
So maybe I'll share a bit of background. So I spent the first 15 years of my career managing warehouses across Europe, primarily in Great Britain and Ireland. And many of the people that worked for me were Eastern European. And what I observed pre-Brexit, and what I observed, a couple of things. I observed several things, but a couple that I'd like to discuss. Number one was the work ethic of Eastern Europeans in Great Britain. Their work ethic was to arrive early, to work extremely hard. They were respectful. They were humble. When I talk about they, I'm talking about Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Slovakians, Slovenians. These are the individuals that I worked with. They would leave late, having fully taken care of all of their chores. They seldom asked for work and time off. They were particular, and it impressed me to no end, to the point where I fired many British workers because they were lazy, they were late, and they didn't do a good job. So that was one observation. A second key observation of immigrants I found was they feared losing their job. They feared the establishment. So I'll give you, for instance, I had a worker from Slovakia called Peter. His mother died, and he received work. He came into work one day. There was a warehouse in Manchester, England, and I could tell that he wasn't well. And so I said, Peter, what's going on? And he said, it's just not a good day for me. Now, if that were in the US, what would someone say? My mother's just passed away. But he was fearful to talk with me about his mother, the funeral, and I believe getting time off. Right? But we bring in this idea of faith into this conversation and being human. And I kept asking Peter what's going on clearly through the day. Eventually I got to the point where his mother had passed away, and I said, would you like time off? He said, no, I really should stay for work. I had to push him to go to his own mother's funeral. And as I went home and spoke with my wife, she said, why don't we help Peter? So she was the one who gave some money to Peter, and he went to his own mother's funeral. So these are my observations about my experience with immigrants in the UK. So what we see in the news often is the argument that immigrants are taking our jobs and so forth. And my argument back is that was not my experience. And I would presume, we've talked about this, Jason, that most of those that came as part of the Windrush generations worked very hard and contributed to society in meaningful ways.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell a lot of folks ended up working for Transport for London, for instance, and that it was hard to break into that. And they had to fight really hard just to have those positions, because they would hear people if they see a black person driving the bus, well, they just get on the bus. And they're like, no, right? We need a job. And so they had to fight for the space, and they didn't let go once they had it. Right? It's you have to make your place.
That question, it often comes up culturally that you come to the point where you can't imagine them out. And so my basic question here is, knowing 20th century British literature and 21st century British literature, isn't Zadie Smith, would you consider
Absolutely.
one of the major European novelists of British novelists, and her mother's Jamaican, of course, and she's of the Windrush generation. She's Zadie's born in the early 70s, and so when is British culture not racially segregated anymore, but so intertwined with the black experience of Britain that British culture itself is the black experience of Britain in some of its pillars, right?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I think, there's a version of the question that's sort of like, back to my point about Britain always being multicultural. That, like, when you think about it, there's a certain false dichotomy that's baked into it. On the other hand, right, there's also a not yet. That's be part of it. Like, there's an interesting memoir from, I want to say, like 2016, 2017, by one named Efwa Hirsch, who's of Nigerian descent. But she grew up in Wimbledon, which is not, I'll put it mildly, a rough neighborhood. And so, as one of like the few black people living in Wimbledon, and she grows up in like immense privilege. She's her partner is from Tottenham, which is a more historically sort of like black neighborhood, and like grew up in poverty, and they just had radically different experiences growing up in London at the same time, and they're like, both of them in different ways like felt like they didn't belong, but they felt like they did belong in really different ways, And growing up in Wimbledon, she feels sort of like weirdly divorced from what might be called a sort of like common Black British experience. But still hers was a Black British experience. And like, so her memoir is her thinking through this, right? And, like also like traveling back to like Ghana and Nigeria, and also feeling like she doesn't fit in there either, right? And so like there's a sort of like not yet, and I think the Windrush scandal illustrates that as well. I mean, that's very recent history, where people thought they were integrated. Like, they had the experience of themselves as like, I'm thoroughly integrated into British society. I have no conception of identity that is not British, right? And then they have that self-conception challenged by the government, with like significant ramifications for their quality of life. And so, and if you watch the aftermath of the Windrush scandal, you see, so the like London New Year's fireworks last year had this sort of like Windrush moment, right? Celebrating Windrush 75. And so you see all these things that sort of like put the public face on like, we are so welcoming of the Windrush generation. We celebrate its contribution to Britain becoming a multicultural society, but there's still some element of sort of like window dressing about that doesn't always capture the complexities of people's experience. So there is a not yet to that.
We'd like to open up the in general now to questions. You can come up here if you're afraid you're not going to be heard and speak, or you can just shout really loud. I also want to invite you, anybody, if you need to leave early, feel free to. There are British and Caribbean treats, and especially the kind where they overlap. These macaroons are one of the places that are well known and have integrated themselves into British culture. And we have some more traditionally British treats back there as well. Feel free to do that. If you want to talk about your own experience or something or have a question, please feel free to join the conversation.
While people are preparing a question, let me just add one thing. It was mentioned, but let me mention it again. Many of the people that came early, 1948-ish, many of them had served in the British military during World War II. Significant contributions to the empire. And then they returned to Britain to work, and their experience was extremely different. From a cultural perspective, just think about that for a moment. The country that welcomed you was grateful for your service. You return, and that same country is put on a completely different face. It's no longer a home, but it should be a home. The must have been extremely hard for the early immigrants that came over. So
Disorientation of thinking you knew how to live in a place because you had actually lived in a place,
Yeah.
and then finding out you didn't know how to live in a place.
not too many years.
Yeah. I mean, like 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
3 years.
Something I think that maybe is on the line.
There's a
Go ahead.
comment over there, a question, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Nathan.
Go ahead. I still got it.
Something that might come up is what is the difference, if these are happening in some really important years in the United States for civil rights, some really important, you're talking about 1959, 1962, 1968, these are really, really central times here. What is the bleed over, the conversation between the United States and Britain?
So I'll stab at this first, then we'll get your thoughts, Jason. So, spending lots of time in London, this is my observation. America is probably around 20 to 40 years behind Britain when it comes to the way blacks and whites interact, desegregate, and then the institutions and the questions there. So I think Britain is ahead of the US there. I think there's some things to learn. But, one thing is just the idea of time and healing. So I'd like to get you, do you agree with that or disagree? But that's generally my observation, spending time in London and then all around the US, is that Britain is 20 to 40 years ahead of the US when it comes to how whites and blacks interact.
Yeah, I mean, that's my sense of things as well. So I was just looking at the Rivers of Blood speech again before coming over here, and Enoch Powell invokes 1960s sort of like civil rights situation in the U.S. there, and he's like, this is a nightmare that's about to descend upon our soil, kind of is his take of it. But there's this sort of not quite true, sort of like just so story that kind of, I'll say, like white British culture likes to tell itself, which is that we didn't have slavery on British soil. And I think that this is that story is not actually really factually true, but it does make a difference. Like so there still is like a slave owning class in Britain. They're just all invested in plantations elsewhere, right? They're actually, then it goes to the heart of British government and society.
So we own the casino, but we don't gamble.
Yeah, like the head of the Royal African Company was the future King of England, right? It's like and the City of London was a major investor. It's like at the heart of British society. And so, so there's some sort of like self-deception about that, but I think it also means that like there's a sense that like people are over there and we're over here, right? There was more sort of like geographic separation, which meant that when people came over, like there was sort of de facto segregation that started to happen, but it wasn't based on a sort of like pre-existing social structure that was entrenched in like London or Nottingham or Leeds or in the same way as like Atlanta.
I agree. Yeah.
So I mean that is a significant cultural or difference.
Good.
I mean, but it also sort of like, we don't have racism here in the way, because the U.S. example is sort of like so bad that it mutes the British in ways that can ring false.
Nathan?
Yeah, I was just like considering like how far the Caribbean is away from Britain and how close America is. I'm just curious, like, I mean, it was a part of the British Empire at that time. And so there is that connection. But I'm just curious in regards to like, why did the people
for hundreds of years?
Yeah, like why did they go to Britain? I guess. I mean, besides it being a part of the empire and then feeling like they had a connection there, why go to Britain? Like, I understand those who were going there for the war and came back. It makes sense instead of makes sense going across the Channel versus going across the Atlantic. But I mean, I'm just curious as far as like, why did so many afterwards go to Britain?
Part of the answer is the British identity. like they understood themselves as British. And it's also worth saying, I mean, putting the sort of like that migration into context with, it was already a kind of very, people moved around a lot for jobs. Like it was normal, right? Like it's like, oh, I'm going to go go work in Panama for a few years. I'll come back. I mean, it's this thing that people did. It was sort of normal. So moving around is a thing, and people would go into the United States and work. But it also sort of like bears saying, especially given the sort of like, again, sort of like caveated relatively positive experience that people had with the British military. You contrast that with what you know about being a black person in the southern United States in the middle of the 20th century, and it's like, okay, well, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go here, and think it'll be better, and then it turns out to not be that simple. I think that's part of it. A book that I haven't mentioned is a novel from about 15 years ago by Andrea Levy called Small Island. She was born in 1953. She's a descendant of Windrush immigrants, and it's a novel. It's a novelized, I mean, sort of like historical fiction about Windrush migrants, and it does involve a sort of like brief sojourn in the United States, and it also kind of dramatizes kind of an encounter between like a West Indian servicemen, like in England, with American non-integrated, like segregationist servicemen. So they are aware of the social reality in the United States, and they don't like it. Britain is a more appealing place to go. It's farther away.
I'd also add to that, post-World War II, the economy of Britain was shifting from a war footing back to a consumer footing. You had hundreds of thousands of British dead, especially that age group, 18 to 25, right? And so really was the British government saying, we need you to come to Britain to work in factories, to work in service sector. It was an invitation from the British government.
And you can really closely track the like people were telling, like people in Britain were communicating back to their family in the West Indies what the situation was, and so the migration patterns really closely tracked. You had a comment.
Yeah, I'm just saying they did actively recruit. I mean, my parents were part of that group, and so they were given incentives, financial incentives to come. So,
in case the people in the back can't hear you, let's see if we can turn this on.
I'm not sure if we get anything noteworthy.
I think you do.
I was just saying, yeah, my parents came over there in the mid-50s, and yeah, they would tell us stories about them actively recruiting people and telling them about the, you know, the great opportunities that if you were to come over to Britain, all the benefits that you would have, and yeah, so financial incentives, and sometimes they tied you into it by paying for your passage and saying once you start working, then you kind of have to pay us back. So you're kind of tied to them. So some people were so far into it, they actually wanted to go back, but they couldn't because they were in debt. So there was some kind of... my parents also talked about they could have gone to Canada. Canada was recruiting at the time. So some of our family went to Canada. Some of them went to the UK. I'm kind of still mad that they didn't go to Canada. But anyway.
I saw another hand back here.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say... Sure. I was wondering if you could share any perspectives you have on similarities and differences between this Windrush scandal in the 2010s and ongoing challenges and debates with DACA in the U.S. Because you've got a very, very similar kind of situation of people who are like, this is the only home I know, and then being told actually, like, there's not legal grounds for your identity and your like version of home. And so what are some of the similarities and differences that you see?
Yes, the economists would argue, right, that if you're not paying taxes, you're not able to sustain a sort of a liberal government. That's the economist argument, right? So close the borders, let people in, trickle in, that contribute. And then Rob and I talked about the idea of open borders, right? What would the open borders do? The answer I have to find is somewhere in the middle. But what I would say is that empathy toward the lived experience of people that claim to be America as my home. I can only imagine what it would have been like to be told that your home is no longer your home. So Yeah, I mean, it's a complex issue. I think empathy needs to play a role here. I don't think the numbers, the economists have all the answers. Um, Boy, broad strokes, right? We need to start somewhere. Yeah, it is a very, very complex, challenging issue for sure.
Well, and I think one of the factors there too is, I mean, it comes back to definitions of citizenship, because part of the kind of legal issue informing that is birthright citizenship. The kind of complex irony here is that we have birthright citizenship as a result of the Reconstruction Amendments, right? It was a way of making sure that all the slaves, we affirmed the citizenship of previously enslaved Black people, right? It was a way of saying, look, we're expanding our definition of citizenship in a deliberately inclusive way, right? But now that definition is also turning out to have this sort of exclusive other side, right? Which I don't think was an intention of the Reconstruction sort of reframing of the constitutional situation, right? And so like that's another one of the complexities, right? Like how do you define citizenship in a way that actually incorporates the people that should incorporate it? And that turns out to be just a kind of perennial issue, right? And who gets the political credit for solving the immigration, whatever, and do we want, like that's the issue right now.
Europe's a good example, right? The British in the early 90s said this is awful. Eastern Europeans are taking our jobs, but over a decade, 15 years, we sort of settled the curve. So an initial, comfortable initially, right, as British, but over time the settling. Now you look at Eastern Europe, you look at the economies in Eastern Europe and how robust they are compared to where they were 20, 30 years ago. And so I'm a huge fan of this idea of moderation. Sometimes we have to go through, we have to suffer somewhat in order to achieve a greater good for more individuals. And so that's something that we don't talk about enough, which is what are we willing to forego in order to have more people have a better life?
How much cultural discomfort are we willing to endure, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for our panelists for taking the time to put all of this together for us. Thank you very much. I want to encourage everybody in your reading and in your viewing to put together, what is the name of Steve McQueen's excellent series?
Small Acts.
Small Acts is a very, very interesting history of Black London specifically, and some of the neighborhoods and some of the interactions with the police right there. Rye Lane is a recent rom-com that is phenomenal. That's with two Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean British people who are in love and falling out of love and sparring on the streets. Have you seen Rye Lane, Marie? Anything you want to suggest, Marie, or anybody else?
Afterwards, because there's so many things I want to say.
All right. Zadie Smith's White Teeth and some of her other novels are phenomenal. These are great places to dig in here and understand why the food in Britain is so much better now. Where would we be without?
About how depressing the food is when they arrive. Like, oh my goodness.
Right, and now we have Nando's. Cheeky Nando's. Where would we be without the peri peri? So anyway.
I didn't know you could do that to food. Right.
That's exactly right. But so how the West Indians and Indians saved Europe's Britain's food is a long talk. Can imagine going without a curry. All right, if you please, speaking of food, come back here and snarf up our treats and think about it. Stay and chat and have any and discuss any comments you might have or suggestions. Marie obviously has lots of suggestions of things to watch and to listen and to read. Thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate it.